At midnight, a child appeared at the billionaire's door. "Please, save my mum." It started with 3 desperate knocks at midnight. Not on any door, but on the door of a billionaire who believed nothing human could reach him anymore. Outside, a 7-year-old girl stood barefoot in the rain, clutching a torn stuffed rabbit, whispering, "Please, mister, my mum's not waking up." Inside that mansion of glass and silence, Ethan Moreland, a man who built an empire out of control, froze for the first time in years. What would you have done in his place? Welcome to Emotional Echoes, a channel where emotions come alive and every story leaves a lasting echo in your heart. Please subscribe to the Emotional Echoes channel. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers so more souls can feel these stories. Stay with my video till the very end and let me know where you're watching from so I can see how far this story spreads. Now, let me tell you what really happened that night. It's midnight, but Ethan Moreland was still working when the sound came. 3 sharp knocks, quick and uneven, cutting through the quiet of the glass mansion. He froze for half a second. Nobody ever knocked at this hour. People emailed, called, scheduled. But the sound came again, louder, desperate. Cameron appeared in the doorway, his face pale. "There's a kid at the gate, sir. Says her mum's hurt." Ethan looked up from his laptop, frowning. A child. At midnight. He stood slowly, buttoning his jacket. "Let her in." Cameron hesitated. "Sir, it could be a setup." He didn't answer, just stared until Cameron moved. The front door opened, and cold air swept down the hall. A small figure stood there, trembling. She couldn't have been more than 7. Barefoot, soaked, clutching a torn stuffed rabbit. Her lips were blue, her hair plastered to her face. But her eyes didn't look away. "They hurt my mom. She's not waking up. Please, mister, help her." For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. He had spent years mastering silence, using it like a weapon. But something in her voice, thin, raw, hopeful, cut through his walls. He asked, "Where's your mother?" The girl pointed behind her. "By the bakery. They said she stole something. She didn't." Cameron shifted beside him, lowering his voice. "Sir, you're one of the richest men in the city. Someone could be trying to use you." But Ethan's gaze stayed locked on the girl. She was shaking, yet she stood her ground. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, clutching the rabbit tighter. "Ellie. Ellie Bennett." The name hit him like a blade. His expression didn't change, but his pulse did. Clara Bennett. The woman he'd spent 7 years trying to forget. The woman who'd walked away before his ambition devoured everything between them. Cameron noticed the change in his face. "Sir, what is it?" Ethan's voice was low, steady. "Get the car." Cameron blinked. "Sir, it's pouring outside, and we don't even know if Ethan cut him off. No trap sends a child in the rain. And yet, part of him wished it were a trap, because that would have been easier than facing the past." Cameron nodded reluctantly and disappeared into the storm. The girl still stood there, dripping, watching him. She looked fragile, but her eyes burned with a strange courage. He took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. It nearly swallowed her, but she held it close like it was the only safe thing in the world. He knelt down, meeting her eyes. "We'll find your mother." She nodded, barely breathing. As they walked to the car, Cameron held the door open, still unconvinced. "You sure about this, sir?" Ethan slid into the back seat beside the girl. "Just drive." The car pulled away, tires hissing on the wet pavement. The mansion lights faded in the distance. Inside, the girl sat quietly, staring at the stuffed rabbit in her lap. Ethan glanced at her, saw the way she traced the torn seam over and over, like she was trying to fix something broken. He looked away, jaw tight. He didn't know why he was doing this. Maybe it was guilt, maybe curiosity, maybe something smaller or bigger than both. When she whispered, almost too soft to hear, "Thank you, mister," something inside him cracked. He turned toward the window, watching the rain streak across the glass. The name Bennett echoed in his mind, over and over. Clara, the one woman who had seen him before he became this, The city lights blurred behind them. For the first time in years, Ethan Morland didn't know what he was driving toward, only that it wasn't business. It was something far more dangerous, something that felt a lot like fate. Cameron drove in silence. The wipers moved in slow rhythm, fighting the heavy rain. In the back seat, Ethan sat beside the girl, watching her small hands twist the sleeve of his coat. Every few seconds, she wiped her face with the back of her hand, too exhausted to cry anymore. He wanted to say something, anything, but nothing came. Cameron finally spoke. "How did you find him?" His tone was calm but guarded. Ellie looked down at her small backpack. She hesitated, then unzipped it carefully, as if it held something precious. She pulled out a worn notebook, its corners soft and pages water-stained. From between the pages, she drew out an old photograph. Ethan leaned closer without meaning to. The photo was faded, creased in the middle, but the faces were clear enough. A younger version of himself stood beside a smiling woman with warm brown eyes. Clara. She was laughing, her hand resting on his arm. The memory hit him like a sudden breath he hadn't taken in years. Ellie held the picture in both hands, looking at it like it was a piece of home. "Mama said never to open this notebook," she whispered. "But when she didn't wake up, I thought maybe the man in the picture could help." Her voice trembled, but there was no fear in it, just hope. Ethan couldn't look away from the image. He remembered the day that photo was taken at a charity event before everything went dark between them. Clara had insisted they take it to prove he could smile without hiding behind power. He never saw that picture again after she left. Seeing it now in her daughter's hands made something inside him shift painfully. Cameron glanced in the mirror, studying his boss. He'd seen Ethan angry, ruthless, even broken once or twice, but never like this. Ethan reached for the photo, his fingers brushing the edge. "She kept it," he said quietly. Ellie nodded. She always carried this notebook. She wrote names, drawings, things she wanted to remember. Sometimes she'd hold it and say your name, but she never told me why. Ethan's throat tightened. For a man who had conquered markets and destroyed rivals, he suddenly couldn't trust his own voice. He turned the picture over. There was handwriting on the back, faint but still there. A single sentence in Clara's careful script. "Some debts can only be paid in kindness." He closed his hand around it, the words cutting deeper than any deal he'd ever made. For the rest of the ride, he said nothing. His reflection in the window stared back at him, a man who once believed emotions were liabilities. But that belief was cracking now, piece by piece, under the weight of a child's voice and a photograph he was never meant to see again. When Cameron asked if he knew where the girl's mother might be, Ethan only whispered, "Behind the bakery on 46th. Then, almost to himself, he added, "She kept it all these years." The car stopped behind the bakery. The alley was silent except for the rain. Ethan stepped out first, scanning the shadows, then motioned for Cameron to stay with Ellie. He pushed open the half-broken door of the red house. The air inside was damp and heavy. A chair was overturned. A lamp still flickered weakly on the floor. There was blood near the kitchen wall. He followed it until he saw her. Clara lay on the floor, half covered by a torn blanket. Her face was pale, one eye bruised, her breathing faint and uneven. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her. "Clara," he whispered, but she didn't move. He lifted her head slightly, his hand trembling when he touched her hair. It was shorter now, but he would have known it anywhere. After a few seconds, her eyes opened weakly. They were the same brown eyes that used to look at him with warmth, now clouded with pain. Her lips parted. "They found me. I thought I had more time." Ethan leaned closer, his voice rough. "Who?" She tried to speak, but her breath caught. "The people you ruined." He froze, his jaw clenched. "Clara, what did they want from you?" She closed her eyes, whispering, "You shouldn't have come back." He swallowed hard, the words cutting deep. "I didn't. She did." Her hand moved slightly, searching. He caught it and held it tight. She tried to smile, but couldn't. The sound of rain hit the roof harder. Ethan looked at the bruises on her arms, the marks that told a story he didn't want to believe. He wanted to ask her everything at once, but she was fading too fast. Clara's voice broke into fragments. I told her, if anything happened, to find you. Ethan's chest tightened. Why me, Clara? Why now? Her eyes glistened. Because she needed to know who her father is. Then her body went still. For a moment, Ethan couldn't move. His mind refused to process the words. He stared at her face, waiting for another breath that didn't come. The room felt smaller, the silence louder. He could feel Cameron calling from outside, but the sound was distant, like it came from another world. He pressed his hand against Clara's cheek. It was cold. The rain outside grew heavier, hitting the roof like stones. His coat was soaked, but he didn't care. Everything blurred until all he could see was her face and the memory of what they once were. Cameron finally entered, saw the blood, and froze. He reached for his phone, but Ethan stopped him. Wait. His voice was barely audible. She's still breathing. We take her to Roman's clinic. No hospitals. Cameron nodded and rushed out to start the car. Ethan lifted Clara into his arms. Her head rested against his chest, her skin cold against his warmth. As he carried her through the door, Ellie ran toward him, her eyes wide with terror. Is she going to die? She asked. Ethan looked down at her, the weight of her question heavier than anything he had ever faced. Not while I'm alive, he said quietly. They reached the car. Cameron opened the door, and Ethan placed Clara carefully across the back seat. His hands were covered in blood. He looked down, his voice cracking. She kept it all these years. He didn't know if he meant the photograph, the memories, or the love she once had for him. As the car sped away, he looked out the window. The rain blurred everything, but in that blur, he saw flashes of their past laughter, sunlight, promises never kept. That night, Ethan Morland realized he hadn't lost everything. He just didn't know what was left. Dr. Roman's clinic was the only place Ethan trusted. It was hidden behind an old church in Brooklyn, a place where questions were never asked. When the car stopped, Ethan didn't wait. He carried Clara inside, her head resting against his shoulder, her breathing faint and uneven. Roman looked up from his desk, his eyes widening when he saw who it was. On the table, quickly, he said, his voice steady despite the shock. Ethan laid Clara down. Her shirt was soaked in blood. Roman's hands moved fast, cutting the fabric, checking her pulse, calling his assistant. Ethan stood there frozen, watching the life he had once lost bleed out in front of him. His hands were still trembling when he tried to wipe the blood from her face. The smell of antiseptic filled the room, but all he could taste was guilt. For a moment, time slipped away. He was somewhere else, years earlier, lying on the pavement beside a burning car. A younger man, full of arrogance and ambition, clutching his chest and cursing the world. The sound of sirens had faded, but a woman's voice stayed. It's okay. You're safe now. Clara had been a nurse at a small clinic then, still wearing her hospital badge when she knelt beside him. He remembered how she didn't flinch when she saw the gun near his hand, didn't walk away like the others. She just pressed her palm against his wound and said, "Don't move. I've got you." That night, she saved him. He had promised to thank her properly, but instead, he vanished. He built his empire, forgot her name, and called it success. Until now, Roman's voice pulled him back. She's lost a lot of blood, but there's a chance if we keep her stable. Ethan nodded, barely breathing. He looked at Ellie, who was sitting on a chair near the corner, her legs drawn up, holding her stuffed rabbit tight. Her eyes were wide, her voice shaking. Is my mum gonna die? Ethan turned toward her. For a second, he didn't know how to speak. The truth would crush her, but lies never saved anyone. He knelt down, resting a hand on her shoulder. Not while I'm alive. She stared at him, searching his face for something she could believe in. He didn't move until Roman called his name again. When he stood, his eyes were wet, though he didn't notice. He had seen too many people die. But not this one. Not her. Roman worked quietly, stitching the wound, muttering to his assistant about blood loss and shock. Ethan just stood there, silent, watching the monitor blink faintly with every weak heartbeat. Cameron waited outside the door, giving him space. Ethan's hands were still stained red. He didn't bother to wash them. He couldn't. Each drop reminded him of how much he owed her. She had saved him once when he was nothing, and he repaid her with silence. Now silence was all he had left. At dawn, Ethan stood by the window of his office, still wearing the same blood-stained shirt from the night before. The city outside looked calm, unaware that his empire was cracking beneath its glass surface. Cameron entered quietly, holding a tablet, his voice low. "You need to see this, sir." Ethan didn't turn at first. When he finally looked, his face hardened with every page he scrolled. Bank transfers, encrypted messages, signed documents all pointing to one name: Victor Hall. Cameron spoke carefully, as if every word might ignite something. "He sold our internal data to Vescari Holdings. They were the ones who ordered the attack. They wanted leverage to force you into signing over your assets." Ethan set the tablet down, his hand trembling slightly before it turned to a fist. His voice came out cold, sharp enough to cut glass. "He sold my empire and almost killed my family." He stared at the reflection in the window, a man who had built an empire out of fear and control, now realizing both had turned against him. The silence stretched thin before he spoke again. "Pull every record. Freeze his accounts. I want every dollar he's ever touched traced before sundown." Cameron hesitated. "Sir, this could go public." "The board will." Ethan slammed his hand against the desk, the sound echoing through the room. For once, the mask cracked. His eyes burned, voice breaking through years of restraint. "I don't care about the board. I care about what he took." He turned, picking up the framed photo. Clara had once given him the same one Ellie had carried through the rain. Her smile in that picture felt almost alive. "You saved me once," he whispered. "This time, I won't fail you." Cameron stepped back, quietly making the calls. Within hours, lawyers, analysts and security teams filled the building. Ethan moved between screens and conference calls like a general preparing for war. The calm precision that once built his empire now turned into something ruthless. Vescari Holdings fought back hard. News outlets exploded with headlines accusing Moreland Industries of fraud and manipulation. Stocks plunged. Investors panicked. But Ethan didn't flinch. He fed the press proof of Victor's betrayal, leaked financial documents that tore the rival company apart. Every move was surgical, every statement deliberate. By nightfall, he had turned the narrative around. Victor Hall was branded a traitor, Vescari Holdings under federal investigation. But victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt hollow, like surviving a fire that had already burned everything worth saving. Cameron entered again, exhausted but relieved. "You did it, sir. You turned it all around in one day." Ethan didn't answer. He stood behind his desk, eyes fixed on the dark city skyline. For a brief moment, the world was quiet again, too quiet, the kind of silence that hides a storm. He felt it before he heard it, that faint, uneasy pull in his chest, as if something was missing. He reached for his phone just as it began to ring. Unknown number. He almost ignored it. Then he heard a small voice, trembling. "Mr. Moreland, please." It was Ellie. Her voice cracked into sobs before a rough man's voice cut in. "You've been busy, Mr. Moreland. Let's talk about what happens when people cross the Vescari family." Ethan's entire body went still. "If you touch her, I'll..." The man laughed. "You'll do nothing, unless you want to hear her scream again." The line went dead. The silence that followed was louder than thunder. Cameron saw his face and froze. "Sir?" Ethan spoke slowly, every word shaking but clear. "They took her." Cameron reached for his phone. "I'll call the police." Ethan's voice dropped, dark and steady. "No police. This is on me." He turned back to the photo of Clara, running a thumb across her smiling face. For years, he had fought to protect his empire. Now, the only thing worth saving was the family he almost never had. Outside, thunder rolled across the city. The lights flickered, rain beginning to fall again. Ethan looked out at the storm gathering beyond the glass and whispered, almost to himself, "I built everything to protect myself. and it still wasn't enough to protect her. Behind him, Cameron waited for orders, but Ethan didn't speak. Not yet. He stood there, letting the weight of the moment sink in the calm before the reckoning. The man who once ruled the market with fear now faced something far more powerful: love and the price it demanded. The rain came down in sheets, drowning the city lights until everything blurred into silver and black. Ethan drove fast, following the blinking dot on the tracker Cameron had sent him. The signal pulsed near the Hudson River, an abandoned warehouse that once stored construction steel. He parked 2 blocks away, stepping out into the storm without hesitation. Every drop that hit his face felt like punishment he'd long owed himself. Inside the warehouse, flickering red lights cast long shadows on the concrete floor. Victor Hall stood near the back, his suit soaked, his grin sharp. So this is what it takes to make the great Ethan Moreland crawl out from behind his glass walls. Ethan's voice was steady, low enough to drown in the thunder. "Where is she?" Victor laughed. "You built an empire on broken lives. You think taking a child makes you any different from the rest of us?" Ethan stepped closer, his eyes like steel. "You think hurting a child makes you powerful? That's not power. That's rot." Victor's smile faltered. He lifted a gun, pointing it toward the corner. "Then, let's see what your power is worth now." From the shadows, Ellie whimpered, tied to a chair, rain dripping through a hole in the roof above her. Ethan's pulse roared in his ears. His world narrowed to that sound, her breathing, shallow but alive. He raised his hands slightly. "You want leverage. You already have it. Let her go." Victor circled him, voice slick with spite. "You ruined me, Ethan. You froze my accounts, humiliated me in front of the board. You think money is power? Watch how fast it burns." Lightning cracked outside. For a second, the whole room lit up, and in that flash, a figure appeared at the doorway. Clara. She was pale, her arm still wrapped in bandages, but her eyes burned with something fierce. She had followed the signal too. When Victor turned at the sound, she stepped forward, trembling but unafraid. "Let her go, Victor. It's me you want." Ethan froze. "Clara, no." The gun fired. The sound tore through the air. Clara staggered, her hand clutching her side as blood spread beneath her fingers. Their eyes met his wide with horror, hers steady, calm. She whispered something he couldn't hear over the rain. Then she fell. Ethan moved before thinking. He lunged at Victor, slamming him into a pillar. The gun clattered to the floor. They struggled, the fight raw and desperate, years of anger and guilt erupting in every strike. Ethan pinned him down, his voice breaking through the chaos. "You took everything, not this time." Victor spat blood, laughing weakly. "You think this changes anything?" Ethan didn't answer. He just turned, saw the fire spreading from the overturned oil lamp, and sprinted toward Ellie. The ropes were wet but tight. He ripped them loose with shaking hands. Ellie threw her arms around his neck, sobbing, "Papa, don't leave her." He looked back. Clara lay motionless near the door, flames creeping closer. Ethan's throat closed. "I'll always come for you," he told Ellie. Then he ran. He lifted Clara into his arms, the heat searing his skin as the roof began to groan above them. Smoke burned his lungs, his vision blurred, but he didn't stop. Every step was a battle between fire and rain. Outside, the storm howled. The moment they broke through the door, the warehouse exploded behind them, orange against the dark sky. Ethan fell to his knees in the mud, still holding Clara, Ellie clinging to his arm. Clara's breathing was faint. He pressed his hand to her wound, whispering her name, begging her to stay. For a second, her eyes fluttered open. She smiled that same quiet smile he had fallen in love with years ago, then slipped into unconsciousness again. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with every beat. Cameron's headlights cut through the rain as he pulled up, shouting their names. Ethan didn't answer. He just looked down at Clara, her blood mixing with the rain, and then at Ellie, who held onto him as if she could keep the world from falling apart. As the sirens echoed through the storm, he finally understood. Some fires burn to destroy, and some to cleanse. The morning after the fire, the world felt strangely quiet. The ocean outside the main house rolled against the shore, soft and endless. Ethan sat by the window, a white bandage wrapped around his hand, the skin underneath burned and raw. The television played in the background, but he wasn't really listening. Headlines flashed. Moreland Industries collapses after scandal. CEO disappears following warehouse explosion. His empire was gone, dissolved overnight like salt in water. Cameron had tried to call, but Ethan didn't answer. For the first time in decades, there was nothing to protect, no board to convince, no fight to win. Just the sound of the sea and the faint hum of the medical machines upstairs. He rose slowly, each movement careful, and walked down the narrow hall toward Clara's room. She was awake, pale, weak, but alive. Her arm was in a sling, her breathing still uneven. When she saw him, a faint smile touched her lips. "You burned your empire for us," she whispered. He stood beside the bed for a long time before answering. It wasn't an empire. It was a prison made of glass. Her eyes softened, but she didn't speak. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It felt like the pause before a new beginning. Ethan reached for her hand, the one not wrapped in gauze, and held it gently. For years, power had been the only thing that made him feel safe. Now it felt like a language he could no longer speak. He sat there until Clara drifted back to sleep. Then he walked outside, where the ocean air cut through the smell of smoke, still clinging to his clothes. He sat on the porch steps, watching the waves break against the rocks. His body hurt everywhere, but the ache didn't bother him. It reminded him he was still here. The phone beside him buzzed again, another message from his lawyers, another warning about bankruptcy proceedings and frozen accounts. He turned it face down. None of it mattered anymore. Money had bought him buildings, influence, and silence. But not one of those things had ever brought him peace. Inside, he could hear Ellie laughing softly with one of the nurses. It was a small sound, like the world learning to breathe again. He closed his eyes, letting it wash over him. For so long, he had measured worth in numbers and headlines. Now it was something simpler, the warmth of a child's laughter, the rise and fall of Clara's chest, the smell of the sea mixing with rain. He finally understood what real wealth meant, the sound of someone he loved, still breathing. A year later, the air smelled of pine and sunlight. The Vermont house sat quietly at the edge of a meadow, where mornings began with birdsong instead of phone calls. Ethan rose early now, not to check stock reports, but to make coffee and feed the stray cat that had decided to stay. His life had become small in the best way possible. Clara ran a small counseling center in town. Every afternoon, women came to talk, cry, and start again. She listened with the patience of someone who had known both fear and survival. Her laughter returned, softer but truer. When Ethan stopped by to bring her lunch, she always looked up from her papers with that same quiet smile that had once saved him. Outside, Ellie sat on the porch, sketching with crayons. Her drawings had changed from dark smudges to bright shapes of houses, rivers, and three figures standing together. She had grown taller but still carried her stuffed rabbit everywhere. When Ethan joined her, she didn't look up, just said, "You're late." He smiled. Old habits die hard. She kept coloring for a while before asking, "Are you my dad now?" Her voice was light, but her eyes searched his face like she already knew the answer. He set down his coffee, thinking for a moment. "If you still want me to be." Ellie grinned, that big, fearless smile that always undid him. "I already decided." She leaned against his shoulder, her small hand slipping into his. They stayed that way, watching the wind move through the trees, the world finally calm. Later that day, Ethan went to the town square for the opening of the Moreland Foundation. The banner above the door read, "Hope Restored." He didn't give speeches anymore. He just stood in the back, watching children laugh as volunteers handed out books and meals. For once, he didn't feel like an outsider looking in. That night, As the sun sank behind the hills, he sat by the porch again, listening to Clara's voice from inside and Ellie's laughter drifting through the open window. The empire he once ruled was gone, but something better had taken its place. He had rebuilt, not with glass towers or money, but with grace and second chances. He once built an empire for power. Now he was building one for love. The town hall was full that morning. Reporters, families, and children gathered as the banner for the Moreland Foundation hung above the stage. Ethan stood behind the podium, not in a suit of power but in a simple grey jacket. His hair had streaks of silver now, and his face carried the calm of someone who had already lost everything once and learned what truly mattered. When the applause faded, he looked out at the crowd. For a second, he saw not the audience but all the faces that had shaped him. The people he had hurt, the ones he had saved too late, the woman who had taught him to feel again. His voice was quiet but steady as it filled the room. Power isn't control. It's the courage to protect what you love. The words hung in the air, soft yet heavy. The crowd fell silent, listening not to a speech, but to a confession. He spoke of change, of building something that could outlive money and fear. He said that sometimes redemption doesn't come through success, but through service, and that every act of kindness leaves a mark no scandal can erase. In the front row, Ellie sat with her legs crossed, clutching the old photo she had once found in her mother's notebook. The edges were worn now, the image slightly faded, but she smiled as she looked at it. A picture of her mother and the man who had once been a stranger, now standing tall under the same light. When she glanced up, Ethan's eyes met hers, and the look they shared was full of unspoken words. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment. The light from the windows reflected in his eyes, softer than it used to be. He stepped away from the podium, walked toward Ellie, and rested a hand on her shoulder. She leaned into him without hesitation. The man once feared for his power was now remembered for his grace. Morning sunlight slipped through the kitchen window, painting the small Vermont house in soft gold. Ethan sat quietly at the table, a mug of coffee warming his hands, watching Clara move between the stove and the counter while Ellie set the plates. The smell of pancakes filled the air, simple and perfect. Outside, the snow was melting, the world beginning again. One picture hidden in a notebook, one knock at midnight, and a man who thought he was beyond saving found his way home. Ellie laughed when Clara dropped a spoon, and Ethan caught himself smiling too. There were still scars, both seen and unseen, but the silence in their lives was no longer heavy. It was peace. He no longer thought about the buildings he had lost, or the empire that bore his name. He thought about mornings like this one, about the sound of his daughter's laughter, and the woman who had once saved him without asking for anything in return. He had lived long enough to learn that redemption doesn't arrive with grand gestures. It comes quietly, through forgiveness, through the courage to love again. Every sunrise now reminded him that healing is not about forgetting the past, but choosing to begin anyway. If this story touched you, share it, because kindness sometimes begins with a child brave enough to believe. Subscribe to Emotional Echoes. Thanks for listening.